Hi there, and welcome to today's lecture for Biology 101 statewide online. Today we will be talking about ecology, primarily population ecology and community ecology. This begins the fourth block of your semester that covers the large-scale things. And we'll see in a moment how a lot of the stuff we've dealt with before has been smaller, organismal, and so on, and now we're moving on to things like populations. So without any hesitation, let's jump right in. So the study of ecology is basically studying interactions of living things in the world and their relationship to their environment. One thing to keep in mind here is that many people consider the word ecology to be a synonym with the word environmentalism. And really, these are two very different things. Ecology is the study, the science that goes on. People who are environmental activists may take some of the conclusions of that science and apply it to things that they believe are right or wrong, but there's really no judgment in the ecology part. Environmentalism is kind of that action. And so really, ecologists are just trying to learn more about the natural world. And so ecology is a fun branch of science. A lot of times people think of biology as people in laboratories working with microscopes and things like that. But ecologists are a type of biologists who get to go outside and do a lot of things inside natural settings. So a population is all the members of a single species that live together in a specified geographical area at a specific time. In the next section we'll talk about communities, which are groups of species or groups of populations living in a single area at a given time. And so if we talk about this in terms of scales of life, basically we're moving up here. An ecosystem is the community and all the non-living elements that interact with it. And lastly, the biosphere. So if we jump onto this image here, you can see at the beginning of the semester, we started off talking about things like atoms, which made molecules. Molecules made organelles. Organelles made cells. Cells made tissues. Tissues made organs. Organs made organ systems. And we combine those together to get organisms. If we combine organisms together, we get populations. And if we look at different populations if we look at populations of different organisms in the same place at the same time, we get a community, groups of interacting organisms. If we then take those groups of interacting organisms and start to consider them in a context that looks at the abiotic factors in the environment, so the flow of energy or the cycling of nutrients, we have an ecosystem. We'll talk about ecosystems a lot next week. And if we take all of that together, we've got the biosphere, or the area of the Earth where things can live. Let's move on. Since we know we're talking about populations, let's talk about population dynamics. And basically, to understand populations, ecologists first need to be able to count these things. And there's a lot of different techniques that ecologists use to do this. And so, for instance, one of the things they can do is basically go out at a set period of time and just count the number of organisms they see. In most instances, they'll never be able to count all of them, but at least that will give them an idea of the population size. In fact, one very famous count is the Audubon Society's Christmas bird count, where people all over the country on the same day go out and count birds of every species they can to try to estimate how these populations are changing over time. But other things you can do, you don't have to actually see the animals themselves. You can look at tracks, right? They're very cryptic organisms, and people wonder, well, how many of these are around? You may very rarely be able to find those organisms, and so you need to use something like tracks or even feces. If you find feces of an organism, that's an indication they've been there. Some other interesting ways we measure populations, hunting. If you have X number of hunters and they're very successful, it implies there were lots of animals that year. Also, hunters are often given surveys. How many of these other species did you see while you were hunting deer, for instance? So a lot of times hunters are asked about turkey populations, coyote populations, even if they were out hunting deer. Roadkill. If we presume that roads have consistent usage. As animal populations go up, we expect to see more roadkill. And so I'm elaborating on this as kind of an example because a lot of the techniques used by ecologists, while advanced, are not what you might think of. They don't sound very scientific, but they come up with great ways of doing things because they don't always have the advantage of a lab. They have to interact with the natural world and take advantage of what they have. So now that we know about ways we might count populations, let's go ahead and look at how they grow. And we're going to start off our growth with an arithmetical increase over time. And so what we mean by that is, let's take a graph here, and we've got time over here, clear, time, and we have number of individuals. And let's say we started with 2 individuals, and then the next year we had 3, and then we had 4, and then we had 5, and then we had 6, and so on. That would be an arithmetic increase. With each time step, this could be years for instance, we're adding 1 individual to the population. But consider for a moment, is this really realistic for biological populations? And there's additional things that we need to consider there. And this is that organisms beget organisms. Or what do I mean by that? Let's say we start off with 2, and those 2 organisms mate, and they have 1 offspring. We're starting off like we did before. But the next year, there's 3. And so if there's 3 now, there's 3 that can reproduce. And so instead of going from 2 to 3, we may actually just double. We may go from 2 to 4. And as we go from 2 to 4, now that we've got 4, if all of them are going to reproduce, maybe we go to 8. And if we go to 8 and all of them are going to reproduce, we go to 16, and so on. And so the population increase follows this J-shaped curve as opposed to this linear one. Here, we'd say we'd add 1 individual every year, but that's not realistic because the more individuals you have, the more they reproduce. So instead of going 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. And so populations can rise very rapidly. That's exponential population growth. But, so we kind of know this population growth, not typically very realistic for biological populations. And we're left with this one. But is this one realistic? Is this a realistic way that populations could grow where they go up and up forever? If you remember back to your math class with exponential growth, numbers can get very large very fast. And if your intuition was that no, this is not going to occur, you're correct. Because really, what's going to happen is the environment is going to limit that population size. What do we mean by that? Well, we end up with something known as the carrying capacity. Okay? K. And what goes on with the carrying capacity is that this is the limit that the number, sorry, let me rephrase that, the number of individuals that can survive in a given environment, given the limited resources. So let's use an example to try to explain this. If you had squirrels, and there are 10 trees that produce acorns, and each squirrel can survive by eating the acorns from 1 tree, we might expect that the population of squirrels that could exist would be 10, because they each live by 1 tree, they each have enough acorns, and they each survive and reproduce. But what happens if then we end up with more than 10 squirrels? Well, there's still only 10 trees making acorns. And so those squirrels end up in competition and fighting, and at the end of the day, those trees can still only support 10. And so this brings us to a S-shaped growth curve. And what happens is that at low population sizes, the growth of the population occurs very rapidly. This is almost following that J-type function where you've got 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 8, and so on. And the reason is if you imagine you just start with 1 squirrel and there's 10 trees, when new squirrels are born, they've all got a place to go to live and eat. There's no competition. Everybody's happy. But as we get a higher population, what starts to happen, individuals, after about this point right here, they're starting to compete with each other. It's getting harder to find resources. A given individual can't get enough resources to effectively survive and reproduce. And so what happens is there tends to be a lot of competition, such that the population levels off. And what this means, when this line here is level, and this means that the birth rate equals the death rate. And so the squirrels could end up around that number of 10 in two ways. Either maybe they're just not getting enough energy to reproduce, or two, they're dying and reproducing very rapidly, where each year some die and some are reproduced. But this is basically zero population growth. And this isn't how this always works, though. You'll see an example of your book when a population overshoots the carrying capacity. And this can happen. Taking the example of acorns, there's a lot of acorns produced in a year near the end or in fall. And so you can imagine there could be lots of little squirrels born, and they all find a bunch of acorns, and everybody's very happy. But then those acorns start to run out. And what's going to happen at that point is we're above our carrying capacity. There's not enough resources to support all the individuals, and so that population will crash. Suddenly, there's not enough food for anybody, and so everybody's starving. But once we're down here again, there's a bunch of food. And now that there's a bunch of food down here, oh, well, now we can survive and reproduce. And so over the years, oftentimes, populations will tend to fluctuate around this carrying capacity, where they overshoot it because they reproduce very rapidly. Then there's definitely not enough resources, so they crash. But now that they've crashed, there's more resources available per individual. They're below carrying capacity. They rise again. And so they fluctuate around that carrying capacity. So one thing you might think about, does the Earth have a carrying capacity? Is there a point where our human population rising will have to hit a limit? And the answer is yes. Through technology and farming land that wasn't previously farmed, we can generate more and more food on the Earth. But at some point, there is simply a maximum number of people that the Earth can sustain. And what people are hoping we do is that the world population growth slows down and levels off someplace around the carrying capacity of human population growth, so that we don't have huge booms that we can't support and massive starvation events and things like that. You will talk a little bit about that in your discussion board that, sometime around now that involves world overpopulation. So, we kind of covered what's up here in a few slides. We talked about the arithmetic growth, exponential growth. We talked about these different curves and how these two probably aren't realistic because we need to add a carrying capacity. We talked about the carrying capacity, and we showed you these three graph types. One interesting thing is how fast a given population can grow. And a given population can grow faster if it has a shorter generation time. Or in other words, how long does it take between when an organism is born and when it can mate? And so populations that have very short generation times can increase very rapidly and then crash very quickly. Whereas populations with long generation times tend to approach their carrying capacity and remain around there. And we'll talk about these two different ways the world works in a moment when we talk about R and K type strategies. So, different species have different characteristics that affect the number of fertile offspring they bear. K-type species are around equilibrium. Their populations tend to remain near carrying capacity. They tend to be large, their environment is relatively stable, and they spend a lot of attention on raising their offspring. K-type species tend to be limited by density-dependent factors, meaning that as the population's density goes up toward or above that carrying capacity, there's a strong force to push it back down. So it doesn't tend to fluctuate very dramatically. Where we tend to see more dramatic fluctuations is in R-type species. R-type species are oftentimes called opportunistic. These tend to be small, reproduce very rapidly, and they provide almost no parental care to the offspring they produce. And oftentimes the pressures on these species tend to be density independent, meaning it doesn't matter really how many are there, because the competition isn't that fierce. It's more about luck of the draw, who survives and reproduces. And so here we have an example of kind of classic R and K-type species. K-type species tend to stay around the carrying capacity. As their population goes up, there's slow-lived, a few individuals die, a few reproduce, and we stay around that K. They're limited by their population sizes. Whereas these R-type species, they may have huge reproductive events, but then tons of the individuals die. You can think about if you've ever been outside and you see a big boom of a certain type of insect, where all of a sudden there were none and there's a whole bunch around. What these organisms were doing is they were trying to produce a whole bunch of offspring, throwing them into the environment, and just hoping that some of them survived. These guys still have a K, but what's going to happen is, due to random chance, a bunch are going to die, and so we end up with these rapidly rising populations when they reproduce. End of the year, everybody dies, there's a few eggs left, reproduction, and so on. We were just talking about the death of organisms, and we can consider these deaths in terms of survivorship curves, or basically how soon species tend to die within their lifespan. And so if we look here, we've got late loss, constant, and early loss species. And so when we were talking about those R-selected species where they produce tons of offspring and most of them die, that's like this early loss species. This is the percentage of the population and young and old. In early loss species, there's tons of babies born, but they die right away. And so there's very few individuals at old age who reproduce and then cause that spike again. In late loss species, this is like humans, where infant survivorship in humans is very high, and most people tend to die of old age rather than something in the environment. And in between these two, we have constant loss species, where basically birds don't tend to age very much. They tend to have a random chance each year of dying. And so if you're a bird, every year there's, let's say, a 10% chance you're going to die. And so eventually there aren't very old ones left because they've randomly passed away. We mentioned human populations before, but let's elaborate a little bit more on those human populations. One important point of thinking about human populations is considering what proportion of the populations is at or under the reproductive age. And this is because of these population type pyramids. In a pyramid that is very wide at the base, it means that there's lots of very young individuals. And as time goes on, those young individuals will move up into a reproductive age and have more offspring. And so what that means is that a population that has lots of young individuals relative to older individuals is a population that is growing. And so you can see here, comparing Kenya in 2009 to the United States, there's lots of young individuals here, so this population is going to be getting bigger. If the number of reproductive age individuals is similar to the offspring, that means that the population is remaining relatively stable. And so the United States population is still growing, but it's not growing very rapidly. On average, individuals in the United States are having, each female, I should say, is having slightly more than 2 offspring. And because each female is having slightly more than 2 offspring, the population is growing. And the reason why that number is 2 per female is important. It's because males can reproduce as well, but we really count things in terms of females. And we presume for every female out there that's reproducing, there's a male. And so the replacement value for a population would be as if every female had exactly 2 offspring, a population would be relatively stable if we ignore a bunch of other factors. So the growth rate of human population is slowing down, but it's still growing, and this is because of fertility rate. If we look at this graph here, we can see this kind of exponential population growth, and we worry, are we going to hit a carrying capacity up here? And you can look at this more closely in your book to see how dramatic that increase has actually been. But there are these changes in fertility. even in the developing world, the fertility rate is going down. And when you hear fertility, you think of it like a good thing, like a person being fertile. But what we're talking about here is, again, the number of children per woman. And as long as that number of children per woman is at 2, the population is stable. If it's below 2, the population is declining. These numbers for China may change soon. China had a one-child policy for a while where women were encouraged to not have more than one child. And as such, China's population actually remained relatively stable or even came close to declining for a while. Now, however, that law has changed. So, this reduction in fertility masks enormous differences between fertility in more developed and less developed countries. Less developed countries tend to have much higher reproduction rates. And some scientists believe there's no single threat to the environment and the continued growth of the human population. And others argue that it's more important to consider the use of natural resources per person. And so, for instance, if we look at carbon emissions and their influence on global warming, the per capita emission for people in the United States is far above that of individuals in China. But the total emissions between the United States and China is similar because the population of China is much larger. And this brings us to an interesting point called the IPAT equation. And it's kind of a way of thinking about how the world works with regard to pollution from different nations. And the IPAT equation looks like this. Human impact on the environment, and so we're considering that's a negative impact, is a function of the population size of a given nation, the affluence of a given nation, and we've got this last one here we'll talk about in a second, which is technological innovations. And so, as we mentioned before, the impact of China and the United States at this point in time is very similar. If we look at China, we have a very high population and a moderate level of affluence. If we look at the United States, we have a relatively lower population, but very high affluence. And I probably should have made this one down as well. And in the end, what this means is they have similar impacts on the environment. Now, a country that would have the least impact would be a country that had a low population and a low affluence. However, as it turns out, birth rates in countries tend to be associated with the level of affluence. And what I mean by that is countries that are very developed tend to have women that have fewer offspring. And this is true in nations as they develop and women become more educated, they tend to reduce the number of offspring they have. And so what tends to happen is that very affluent nations tend to keep their populations low, and you end up with this kind of balancing out. Now, what does this mean? United States per capita has per individuals, its affluence, how many resources we use, is very dramatic. And so if you look at it, if the United States has a population of something like 4 million, but we have an affluence value that's very high of, say, 10, our influence might be 40. These are just kind of random numbers that I'm choosing here. This is where technology comes in. We can use technology to reduce the impact of our affluence. So let's say our impact was 10. So 4 times 10 equaled 40. But what if our technology value, because we could reduce the impact due to our affluence, and let's say this is by using renewable energy, was a 0.9. This number, multiplying all this by 0.9, gets us to 38 instead. And so what developed nations are trying to do is they're not tend to have their population growing fast. They tend to be using lots of resources per capita. what they can try to do is use technology to reduce the influence of that affluence or amount of resources they use per person. And so it's kind of a way, an interesting way to look at the world, because it puts things in a context of how both the developed world can work on reducing its population growth. The less developed world can work on reducing its population growth rate, where the developed world can work on reducing its affluence or resource use per person, as well as improving technologies that can help reduce their impact on the environment. So now that we've done that, let's move on to our next presentation here. And I believe this is it. What we have is moving on from population to community ecology. And an ecological community is all the populations of all the species that inhabit a given area at a given time. And many communities are dominated by only a few species, known as ecological dominance. And you look at here, we've got a grassland and a forest. You will see next week we'll talk about biomes. And when you think about these biomes, what you'll recognize is many of them are defined by those ecological dominance. So for instance, a temperate deciduous forest is dominated by trees that lose their leaves. A prairie or a grassland is dominated by grasses. And so when you move on to that next week, try to consider what organisms are the ecological dominants in the different biomes that you look at. Keystone species. A keystone species is a species whose absence from the community would bring about a significant change in that community. And this is a pretty important concept. Your book there has an example with starfish in that picture. But let's go ahead and look at this in terms of, oh, we lost our camera. There we are. Let's look at this in terms of an example that is a little bit more charismatic, and that's wolves at Yellowstone National Park. And so wolves used to be very common in many parts, mostly the northern areas of the United States. And so you had wolves that were predators. And what did those wolves eat? Well, they ate things like elk. And what did those elk eat? They ate things like plants, primarily. We're going to talk about aspen trees. And so what we have here is a very classic predator, herbivore, primary producer situation. And let's actually keep these letters in terms of the ones that we're talking about here. And what happened in this case was that the wolves would eat the elk, and the elk would eat the plants. And so what would happen is the wolves would drive the number of elk down, and the number of elk would drive the number of plants down. And so there was a certain amount of vegetation that we expected to be at Yellowstone. But then humans came along, and they said, well, we don't like wolves. Wolves are bad. They kill things, so we're going to kill them. And so what happened is they knocked out the wolves. Well, what that meant is that the elk no longer had a predator, and so the populations of elk went up dramatically. Well, when the populations of elk went up dramatically, what that meant is they would eat tons and tons and tons of these plants, and so the population of the plants went way, way down. And this is what we mean by a keystone species. The wolves in this equation had a very, very dramatic impact on the environment. And so removing them changed the amount of plants that were in Yellowstone. And what we found out is we removed wolves, the number of elk went up, the number of plants went down. What we're finding now that we've reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, the number of elk is going down, and the number of plants that remain there are returning to a more natural level. And there are many different examples of keystone species, but that's a very classic one. Biodiversity, we hear this word a lot. Biodiversity is defined as a variety among living things, and it takes three primary forms. We've got the diversity of species in a given area, geographic distribution of species populations, and genetic diversity within a species. And so here we've got three different examples, and this species diversity is simply how many species are there in that given area. In this case, we're really talking about in terms of species richness. Okay? How many species are there in this location? And we all can think about a tropical rainforest would have a whole lot of different species. You look at it, it's full of green things, living things, interacting, doing all sorts of stuff. But a desert, for instance, may have very few species there. One thing we're also concerned about is geographic diversity, or do we have our diversity isolated in these pockets, these contained areas where we have tons of species, and then as we move away we don't have that many. This is an important concept because if there is a narrow distribution of species, there's the risk of, if that one area or that one habitat has problems, we could lose lots of species at the same time. And lastly is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is important because, as you remember, genes define phenotype. And what this really means, in some extent, is a phenotypic diversity that's based on genetics. When all the organisms in a population are identical, there's not any variation. So imagine you had a population that was severely reduced very dramatically. Oftentimes what this creates is the bottleneck effect that we learned about before, where the number of individuals is low, and in making that number low, we've lost a lot of the different phenotypes that we might have seen. And so in this case, we're talking, yeah, we can have high genetic diversity where a lot of fish look different, or they can all be the same. And the problem is when they're all the same and they lack that diversity, they may not be able to very easily respond to selective pressures because they lack a variation for certain traits. And if you'd like to look at that a little bit more, you can go back and look at the lesson on evolution where we dealt with that in depth. We've recently found that species diversity tends to enhance a community's productivity and stability. What do I mean by that? Well, you think about a community functioning the way it should, being able to keep all the organisms alive and doing well. High diversity seems to provide security from that community being very disturbed when there are extinctions. What we mean by that is if you've got a community and there's 10 types of granivorous birds, or in other words, birds that eat seeds, and you lose one of them, that might not be a big deal because other birds may start doing something similar to what the birds that are missing did, and the community would be stable. In a community where there was just one species of granivorous bird, if that goes extinct, well, maybe that's going to change all the dynamics. Maybe the plants are going to totally shift, or sorry, maybe what the landscape looks like is going to totally shift because the plant species that are there are going to change. And that's going to impact another organism. And that's going to have a negative impact on another one. And 20 years from that extinction event, the whole landscape may look different than what it looked like before. And so these areas that have high species richness tend to be more productive and more stable. And this brings us to something known as kind of the rivet principle. And the idea is if you've got a stable community, how many species can you take out of it before it totally crashes? And this is the idea here if you've got a plane flying. All right? And a plane might be able to fly if it loses a few rivets holding it together, right? Maybe you lose 1, you lose 2, you lose 3, 4, 20. Who knows? At some point, you're going to lose that one rivet, and that plane will no longer be able to fly because it's falling apart. And that's what we worry about happening with ecological communities. If those extinctions keep up, we lose more and more species until that community changes dramatically because of those losses. So, types of interactions among community members. Your book highlights competition, predation, mutualisms, and commensalisms. But what we're going to do here is look at these in one chart that helps to explain how all these work, and we'll actually add a couple items to that list. And so what I want to do here is draw a chart that looks at the influence of species A on the fitness of species B and species B on species A. So when these two organisms are found near each other, how do they influence each other is what we're asking. And what we have are 9 cells, and we'll just do species A, species B here. And we can have negative, neutral, or positive, and we can have negative, neutral, or positive. Okay? And we can fill out some of these things that we saw already on the previous slide. A negative-negative interaction is competition. If species A is trying to survive eating acorns, and suddenly species B shows up and also wants to eat acorns, they're going to be competing with each other such that they both harm each other's fitness. When A shows up, when B shows up, A is going to have to fight harder. There's going to be fewer individuals of A. Likewise, if A showed up with B, B would have a harder time. So competition are situations where both species negatively influence each other. Positive minus is another very common one. That is predation. And we've got 2 places with that on here. If one species eats another, one species is going to benefit because it got a meal. The other species is dead because it got eaten. And so predation is a classic plus-minus interaction. Another one that we can put on here, mutualisms. Mutualisms occur when both species benefit when they are in the presence of one another. And this might be something that we talked about the other week, like birds and flowers. Even though, in that case, they were locked in an evolutionary arms race, insects and flowers. Insects benefited by getting nectar. Flowers benefited by getting pollination services. And so even though they were in an evolutionary arms race, they both benefited. It was a plus-plus interaction. Let's fill out our 0-0 here. This is mutualism. And this one's tough to come up with because you have to think of an example where 2 species don't influence each other in really any way. And if we take it at a little bit easier level, if we talk about just directly influence each other, you can think about how do you influence the bacteria in the soil along the highway where you drive, right? You probably don't have, as an individual, any sort of huge impact on the bacteria populations that are living there. And so these are basically 2 species that, although you may find them in the same region, they do not influence each other very much. We also have, last on here, commensalisms and amensalisms. Commensalisms are instances where one species gets a benefit, but the other species is not influenced. And so an example that I like to use for this is some research I worked on involving mice and frogs and the predators of those mice. And so if you've ever been outside during the spring, you can hear spring peepers. And spring peepers are making tons of noise. They're constantly chirping. And it's very, very loud in many places. And you can sometimes hear it driving by ponds and things like that. And so what I was interested in knowing was how the sound made by those spring peepers influenced the interactions between owls and foxes and all those group of predators and mice. And so what I did is I played loud spring peeper songs for the mice, and it turns out that it made the mice safer. The mice would spend more time outside eating food because they were getting acoustic camouflage. If owls and foxes can't hear them, they're safer. And so this was an advantage where the mice benefited by the frog calls. But in no way did those mice influence the frogs. The frogs were calling to me. The mice never went back and influenced them. And so that's a great example of commensalism. Now in that same example, we have amensalism. And amensalism is where one species is harmed, but the other doesn't benefit. And in this case, we can use our same example again with the frogs, mice, and the predators of the mice. In this case, the predators of the mice couldn't hear the mice, they couldn't eat them, so they had a negative effect. Meanwhile, no influence on the frogs. And so that is an example of an amensalism. And so there's a bunch of slides that will follow that lay these out in detail, and you can look at those if you want. But for the most part, for the interest of time, we're containing our discussion to this example here. And so these are our modes of interaction. Habitat can be thought of as the physical surrounding in which a species normally can be found. Keep in mind that habitat, oftentimes we refer to that as the type of plants that are around where an animal lives. Keep in mind that habitat are those physical environmental things around where an organism can live. So for instance, a rainforest plant requires high temperature and high moisture. That region has the habitat that it requires. Habitat is not something that just exists for animals. It's the physical environment that permits things to live there. And oftentimes it's biotic as well, because for instance, if you have a given habitat where certain plants can live, that could then allow animals to live there, for instance. A niche is defined metaphorically as the organism's occupation or what it does to obtain the resources it needs to live. And some people say that, call that a niche, and we're going to move on and talk about the niche in terms of competition and the competitive exclusion principle. For two organisms to live in the same place at the same time, they need to be doing different things. Or in other words, for two organisms to exist in the same region, they must do something, sometime, some way different than everybody else that's there. If not, if you took two organisms that were almost identical to each other, eventually one is going to outcompete the other. And so we can look at this in the example of these species here, of Paramecium, where individually they can both survive in an environment just fine. But if we put them together and they eat the same thing, one of them is eventually going to outcompete the other one. It's going to end up with better survival and reproduction. They're going to survive, and due to that negative interaction, if there's more of these guys, they're going to have a more negative effect on these guys, and these purple ones go extinct. But through resource partitioning, we can get coexistence. If you do something, sometime, somehow, some way differently, you can coexist. And this is resource partitioning. And your book gives you this example of how it's divided up. You know, birds use different regions of trees. But let's think about, for a moment, and we'll get our whiteboard back here, how several organisms might be able to survive even using a very similar resource. So let's get rid of our block here. And we earlier talked about seed sizes. Think of an environment where there is a range of seed sizes, from small to large. And over here, we're going to put an organism's fitness. And so what we can do is we can find an organism that maybe likes to eat medium-sized seeds. When medium-sized seeds are around, they have the highest fitness. As there are larger seeds, they don't do quite as well to the point where they have zero fitness if there are only large seeds around because they can't eat those. Or very small seeds, as the seeds get smaller, they can survive and reproduce with those around, but eventually they have zero fitness as we get to those smaller seed sizes. If we drew another species in here that looked like this, it would clearly get outcompeted by the other one, because for this seed size, at all seed sizes, This one has higher fitness, and so it outcompetes that one. And if you drew a species that was right like this, that was so similar to be almost identical, you'd end up with that competitive advantage. But if we partition the resources, if everybody can specialize on a size of seed, we can get multiple organisms surviving in the same environment because they all do something that's a little bit different. This one does great specializing on small seeds. This one on medium seeds. This one on large seeds. And we can even sneak organisms in between these. And in the end, you end up with what looks like a bunch of squiggles. But if everybody's doing something just a little bit different, they'll be able to survive and reproduce. And this doesn't have to be resources. So for instance, it could be times that organisms do things. If one organism is out eating things during the day, and another organism is out eating the exact same thing but during the night, they both have that specialization that they're using, and they can survive. Ability to avoid a predator. If you're a species and you go out and eat stuff all the time, but you're very susceptible to that predator, well, there might be another species that does great when that predator is around. So they're able to go out and eat the food when there's a predator there, and the other one suffers. And so they're doing something different enough that they can coexist with each other. Predation and parasitism are lumped together, and this is because parasitism is simply a form of predation where the parasite lowers an organism's fitness while not actually killing it. And that's the difference. And you can think about it. A parasite that you might get might be a virus that gives you the flu. That flu is going to make you sick and ultimately in some small way potentially impact your survival and reproduction. We can think about this in terms of Ebola, right? Ebola, a parasite that definitely has a high chance of lowering your fitness. And so parasites are simply predators that typically do not outright kill an organism, but have a chance to reduce their survival and reproduction. And so in this case, they're talking about fig trees that grow on top of other plants. Predator-prey dynamics. We've alluded to this already a little bit today. But what you can see here is a classic example of lemmings and stoats. Lemmings do not just throw themselves off of cliffs. They are not going to kill themselves. You could imagine an organism that would voluntarily kill itself would have low survival and reproduction, and so we would not expect that to be a trait that could evolve. But what happens here is as the lemmings populations go up, the stoats, which eat the lemmings, lag behind a little bit and their population starts to rise. Because as this goes up, these guys are getting more food. But as their population starts to rise, they reach a point where there's tons of these guys around killing the lemmings, so the lemming populations decline. As the lemming populations decline, shortly thereafter the stoat populations decline. As the stoat populations decline, lemming populations can go up, and you get this constant back and forth, or the predator-prey population dynamics, where we get this typical cycling. We've talked about mutualisms and commensalisms already today, so we won't spend much time there. And we hinted at coevolution already. We already did a chart similar to this one, which brings us to succession. Succession are when parcels of land or water have organisms move in. And the best example of this is primary succession. When you start off, imagine a volcano erupting in the ocean. That volcano will suddenly create some land there. And when that land starts out, there's nothing there. And what happens is over time you get microorganisms and things like that, and they eventually move on and create some soil. And organisms live in this harsh environment, and as we build up soil, we're then able to have some grasses there. But if grasses are not constantly maintained, eventually some small shrubs and stuff move in and they start to shade out the grasses. And so we move from a grassland on to a brushland. And then in this case, well, yeah, there's a brushland there, but the trees eventually start to grow there, outcompete the brushes, and so we move on to trees and taller trees. And if we leave open areas alone, we expect ultimately primary succession in many environments to lead to forests. But then you may say, well, hey, hold on here. I know that there are things out there that aren't forests. There are things like grasslands. Well, what happens in grasslands is it progresses to this stage, and then it stays in this stage due to fires. Because what happens is as these shrubs start to get established, a fire comes through and kills them. And these R-type grasses that are great at just thriving on openings in the environment end up being able to grow. And then as the bushes come in, another fire comes in. And so we kind of stay in this stage of succession in grasslands because fires are maintaining that system. The final community, if we made it all the way to those trees, is known as the climax community, although, as I said before, we can be held in something that's a mid-climax community by frequent disturbances. And as succession succeeds, you tend to go from very small, short-lived species, like the prairie grasses, to longer, and I shouldn't say that, because prairie grasses can live a long time. But you get the idea of many small species, but eventually you could go from having just insects in an area to things like mammals, longer-lived, larger species. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation today. And today we were primarily talking about biotic interactions. We were primarily discussing how species interact with each other. We started with populations, we combined them together, looked at those interactions. And so those were all biotic factors. What we're going to do next week is take a closer look at these interactions in the context, and add abiotic factors or environmental factors. And that's when we'll be talking about ecosystems. So I will see you next week for that lecture.